California's minimum wage is slated to reach $15 an hour by 2022. What are the implications? We'll ask Steve Smith with the California Labor Federation, Tom Scott with the National Federation of Independent Businesses for California, and Alissa Anderson with the California Budget and Policy Center. California establishes the nation's maximum minimum wage. Will it lead to an economic boom or an economic bust?
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world, and by Kaiser Permanente. Thrive. From the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. So will California's new minimum wage, slated to reach $15 an hour by 2022, be good or bad for the state's economy? Our guests are two proponents of a higher minimum wage. They are Steve Smith with the California Labor Federation. Welcome.
Thank you.
And Alissa Anderson, who's with the nonpartisan California Budget and Policy Center. Welcome, Alissa.
Thanks very much.
So Alissa, let me start with you. Unions and pro-labor groups generally very supportive of this newer higher minimum wage, but opponents have argued there's at least some downsides here. One is higher unemployment, and the other is higher prices. How do you respond?
So we have decades of research that we can draw on looking at the effects of raising the minimum wage at both the state, local, and federal level. And the general conclusion from the research is that modest, gradual increases in the minimum wage tend to have little or no effect on employment. I think the key question for us here in California is to what extent can we rely on the research in this particular case? And what it really comes down to is whether raising the wage to $15 is similar to past increases. And actually, it really is. If you look at how gradually we're going to be increasing the minimum wage, we won't hit $15 until 2022 at the earliest. Once you adjust for inflation and you look at the average increase each year, we're looking at about a less than 5% increase in the minimum wage, which is very similar to what we've experienced in the past. Now, there are some limitations to the research. One, for example, is that it looks like raising the minimum wage to $15 will bring it a lot closer to the median wage than we've experienced in the past. We just don't have research that shows what that might mean. So there's greater uncertainty there.
The key issue here, the key word really is moderate or a modest wage increase. This is a big jump. And now a lot of people are focusing on the $15 an hour in 2022, but you're right, it's steps toward that. Right. But what is your response to that argument?
Well, I'd say that, in the last 2 years, we've had a jump of $1 each year. So we went to 9, then we went to 10. And look at what's happened with employment during those 2 years. Statewide in 2014, we were at 8.1% unemployment in California. Today we're at 5.5. Even look at Fresno County. We have dropped 3 percentage points in those 2 years in terms of our unemployment. And that's $1 each year. We would expect if big jumps in the minimum wage were going to have a severe effect on employment, we'd expect that we would have seen that in the last two years. We didn't. In fact, we saw the opposite, that unemployment continued to go down.
One thing that's kind of interesting here is that New York State recently passed a minimum wage. They're trying to vying who was going to be first, California, New York, but they have something in their law that allows for regional differences. Yeah. Didn't happen in California, and one of the reasons why it didn't happen is labor unions were very much opposed to it, yes. Considered it a non-starter. Why not? Why not have a regional difference?
Well, we consider the phase-in to 15 as the floor. That doesn't mean that in San Francisco you might even need a higher minimum wage than 15, given the cost of living there, given the cost of goods and services. So, but $15 an hour, let's remember, that's a little over $30,000 a year for a full-time worker anywhere you are in the state of California, rural, coastal, inland, wherever. $30,000, that's going to be basically meeting your necessities. So we think as a floor, 15 over time makes sense. We don't want to see workers in Fresno, for example, be left out when that wage increase goes up. We don't want to see competition between cities trying to steal jobs from one another. That's the problem with the regional approach. We think here we've set a floor that's fair, provides a living wage for all workers in the state.
Well, what do you think, Alissa? Should there be regional differences between coastal California and inland California, for example?
I think it seems reasonable that you might want to structure the minimum wage to reflect differences in the cost of living, because we certainly have a great range in California. I think the key challenge is that we don't have good models to look at for exactly how you structure a regional minimum wage. So you mentioned New York, Oregon is also pursuing this approach, and I think they'll provide interesting test cases that we can learn from.
Well, let me ask you this. You've got a COLA adjustment in this, which is kind of unique. After 2022, there's going to be a cost of living adjustment going forward. Now, opponents say that's going to be a problem because it's going to come at the expense of the elderly, for example, on fixed incomes. What is your response to that?
Well, I think actually tying the minimum wage to inflation is one of the most important features of this plan. And that's because if you think about what happens if we don't tie the minimum wage to inflation, we just have to look at the past 50 years to see what happens. And the value of the minimum wage has been eroded significantly because California hasn't consistently raised the minimum wage. And as a result, that's a key reason why we've seen workers' wages erode at the very low end of the pay scale. So a worker earning at the 10th percentile today in California makes about 12% less per hour than a similar worker did a generation ago. And that's because the 10th percentile wages tend to track right along with the minimum wage. So by increasing the minimum wage further, California is going to restore that lost value in the minimum wage. If we'd been indexing all along, the minimum wage would be closer to $12 today. And so in just a matter of years, California will be able to erase decades of wage erosion for the lowest paid workers in our state.
It's interesting because I read a statistic that in 2022, the minimum wage in 1968 money would be $13.79, I think, an hour, so it's pretty close to the $15. But anyway, up next, thank you for the pro side of the minimum wage argument. Up next, we're going to talk about some of the long-term economic and political implications of a $15 minimum wage. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking to Alissa Anderson with the Nonpartisan California Budget and Policy Center and Steve Smith with the California Labor Federation. So, Alissa, from a broader economic perspective, could there be a spillover effect with higher wages for all workers and that leading to higher prices for everyone, which means no net gain for lower income workers?
I don't think we'll see a spillover for all workers. Certainly we expect workers who are earning just above the minimum wage to benefit because typically after the minimum wage is increased, employers tend to shift their pay scales upward. The UC Berkeley Labor Center estimates that almost 40% of the workforce should see their pay increase. In terms of prices, the research there tends to show that businesses do oftentimes pass along some of their increased labor costs in terms of higher prices, but tends to be a pretty minimal effect on prices overall. We see a greater effect in the restaurant industry, but even there, a modest increase in the minimum wage tends to boost prices by well below a penny on the dollar.
There's that word modest again. So what do you think, Steve? Do you think that it's going to be a net gain for low-income workers?
Absolutely. I think if you look at the UC Berkeley Labor Center's research, it shows that at the outer end, there might be a 1% increase in prices, but there's going to be a 24% increase for the salaries of lower wage workers annually. That's a huge differential. And with respect to prices, I think you have to remember the research on this is ongoing, but we just saw the University of Washington publish a study last week in which they looked at Seattle's new minimum wage, which is going to 15, just as ours is. And over the last year, they've seen virtually no impact on prices in the city of Seattle. So again, I think that there could possibly be a minor, modest impact, but compared to the wage gain that workers are going to make, and remember, they spend those wages that they earn back in those same businesses and shops, it's going to be a huge deal.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, what you often hear by the opponents of increasing the minimum wage is it's going to put California at a competitive disadvantage. Will it?
No, absolutely not.
Why?
Again, I think look at what's happened over the last 2 years as the prime example. California has added 1.5 million jobs since January of 2014. And that is the time in which we raised it to 9. We went to 10 the following year. We've led the nation in job growth. Jobs are not going to Texas, to Nevada, to other states. They're actually staying right here, and businesses are thriving.
Competitive disadvantage or not?
In terms of competition, I mean, a lot of the businesses that are affected by a higher minimum wage tend to be, restaurant industry, hotels, businesses that have competitors here locally. What we have right now is a situation where we have higher minimum wages in certain labor markets because certain cities have decided to raise the minimum wage. And so actually by establishing a $15 minimum wage statewide, we're sort of leveling the playing field for businesses who have local competitors.
Yeah, let me kind of switch gears a little bit. Steve, I want to ask you a question.
Yeah.
Minimum wage goes to employees, not independent contractors.
Correct.
Nice thing about independent contractors, you've got flexibility. The downside is you're not protected by a union, you don't have workers' compensation, you don't have unemployment compensation, you generally don't have employee benefits.
Right.
Is an unintended consequence of this going to turn these workers from employees who have some of these protections to independent contractors who don't?
Well, first of all, there are very specific conditions that must be met for an employer to classify someone as an independent contractor. Again, we're talking about a lot of low-wage workers in retail and restaurant industries. These are not independent contractors under any definition. They're employees of a company. However, I will say that this is becoming a big problem with employers misclassifying employees as independent contractors. And it's a problem that we're trying to address in a number of ways. You look at what's happening right now with Uber. They meet a very certain strict criteria for what an employee is, yet Uber is saying that they're not employees so they can get around paying for things like a minimum wage and workers' compensation.
And Uber drivers don't have complete autonomy. There are some rules attached to being an Uber driver.
Absolutely. They don't have complete autonomy, and they do the essential business of the company, and they earn the company profits. And so all of these things, and this is going to be decided in the courts with respect to Uber, but companies can't just say, okay, I don't want to pay the minimum wage, so you're now an independent contractor. That's not how it works.
Let me ask you this. Switch gears a little bit and talk about the politics of all this.
Yeah.
It's interesting that the Governor General has included business when it comes to economic issues and negotiations. And what I'm reading is, not this time, it was kind of a governor, legislature, labor union discussion. Do you think that's going to hurt the governor in terms of getting legislation through in the future?
Well, I don't think so.
Have the lines been drawn?
I don't think so. I think that, this obviously, we had, Labor had 2 ballot initiatives potentially that were going to be on the ballot in November, raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. This was a top priority for us, so clearly we're going to be in those discussions. I don't know what discussions the governor did or didn't have with business around this, but at the end of the day, this governor has shown that he's able to work with business, with labor, and everybody in between, and I don't see that changing.
One last question, and that is, where do we go from here? If we're talking about economic inequality, and minimum wage is supposed to address this, now what?
I think the next big thing that California needs to tackle is our lack of affordable housing. It's a really significant problem, and it's one of the key reasons why we have the highest poverty rate in the nation under the Census Bureau's supplemental poverty measure that looks at the cost of living. It's a problem that's not going away. It's become worse in recent years as rents have skyrocketed, and we now have a situation where the majority of renters are spending more than half their incomes on rent.
That seems to be pretty much a regional problem, though, along the coast. In the inland, it's a little bit easier, but along the coast, it's a definite problem. Anything that you think needs to be the next thing? What's the next thing up?
Well, we are now undoubtedly the leader in the nation in terms of workers' rights and advancing the issues that workers care about. We need to continue that tradition. Governor Brown has been very clear that he wants to do something to address income inequality in this state. I think raising the minimum wage was an excellent first step. There's lots of other things that we need to do, affordable housing being one, but we still need to give workers in this state the opportunity to stand together, have a voice in the workplace, and bargain collectively with their employers.
I guess we're going to find out then. Stay tuned. Thanks for the overview of the economic and political implications of the new minimum wage. Up next, the business perspective on California's new minimum wage. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're now going to get a business perspective on the new minimum wage. Our guest is Tom Scott, the Executive Director of the National Federation of Independent Businesses for California, an organization that represents many of the small businesses most affected by this new minimum wage. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So businesses argued that a higher minimum wage is going to make California less competitive economically. But could you also argue, what about those folks who do argue that it's going to actually make California more efficient with their use of their labor resources, and maybe also a magnet in attracting higher quality workers to California? Isn't there a positive to this?
I just don't see any logic in that argument. The bottom line is people are going to lose jobs, their hours are going to be cut back, you'll see automation. Well,
you're already seeing that now, right? If you go to
Totally.
a food store and you don't have all checkers, there's usually that one place where you can self-check out.
I was talking to a business person today who just on the $10 minimum wage said that they've seen their monthly payroll go up $40,000 to $50,000 a month.
So these are pretty big jumps for a lot of your
big jumps. And like we've talked about, this is not just, the minimum wage is not just $1. It's Social Security, workers' comp, all of the additional costs.
Everything is based on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it adds up. So business groups were pushing for this regional variation. They said, you know, the coast is more expensive than the inland part of California, so therefore there should be a different minimum wage for regionally. What do you say to those who say that, well, if you did that, then the places like the Valley, inland California, become second-class citizens because they have a lower minimum wage?
Well, I don't agree necessarily with the premise that business was pushing for a regional approach. I know there were some discussions about a regional approach. Look, I'm fully aware that the economics of Yuba County versus Fresno County versus San Francisco, sure, there is definitely a different dynamic, but the fact of the matter is NFIB was not about negotiating on the minimum wage. So there was no part of a
You weren't involved?
looking at a regional approach to minimum wage increase.
Well, you know, they did put in an escape clause in this new law. You're
Is that
smiling.
what it's called?
Okay. I'm putting quotes around it, all right?
Right.
And where the governor can step in and say, hey, we can't afford a
An
minimum wage.
off-ramp.
Oh, there you go, an off-ramp. I'm not going to talk about lockbox. Okay, so something. So a governor can say, hey, we can't afford a minimum wage increase this year. Shouldn't that satisfy business concerns?
You show me a governor and a legislature, especially right now, or even the next governor, that's going to have the political guts to hit the pause button. I just don't see it.
Not
I don't think they have
politically
the political guts.
Yeah.
It was, you know, hey, it sounds nice, putting it in, an off-ramp. I still don't even understand how they came up with that term. I mean, most off-ramps here are, you know, blocked with traffic. So, but I just don't think politically, I mean, it sounds nice, but when the rubber hits the road, I don't think a governor or a state legislature is going to hit a pause button. I mean, unless you see a 2008, 2009
recession,
kind of like major collapse.
Yeah. Another unique feature in the law is a cost of living provision. Those who supported it say, listen, minimum wage hasn't kept up with the cost of inflation. And you know, since 1968, low-wage workers have fallen farther and farther behind. This will correct that. Are they right?
You know, I think what businesses, you know, if 40% of your business is a fixed cost on payroll, and okay, you're going to see a minimum wage increase, and then, you know, you're going to start seeing these cost of living increases, whether that's 25 cents, 50 cents, whatever that is. So every single year, you're going to be seeing this increase, yet you're trying to stay with a fixed budget on payroll while all of your other costs are going up. I mean, you know, that's my point to a lot of people is somebody is going to pay. And the business person is either going to have to cut back employees or they're going to have to increase prices. And so the people that are actually wanting the minimum wage, I think, are ultimately going to be the people getting the most hurt by it.
Well, thank you for that business perspective on the new minimum wage. Up next, we're going to talk about some of the prospective economic and political implications of the new minimum wage from a business perspective. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Tom Scott with NFIB. So what do business groups think about the long-range economic and political implications of California's new minimum wage law? So one benefit touted by the supporters of minimum wage is that it's going to move a lot of working poor out of poverty and off public assistance. Isn't that a good thing for the economy?
Well, I think on one level, I know Lorena Gonzalez said that 90% of the people earning the minimum wage are over the age of 21. And I just don't believe that statistic during the floor debate on this. Look, 1 out of every $4 in minimum wage increases actually goes to the working poor. So, you know, as I said...
Why do you say that?
Well, because, you know, there have been a lot of studies that show that, you know, when you really look at who's actually earning the minimum wage, where I think most people feel it's sort of that entry-level position that you know, learn a skill or a trade and then you move to the next level and then to the next level.
Right.
That what we're going to see is people where you're going to see the increase 20 to 30% in costs of goods and services, that the wage is really so incremental compared to what else is going on in a person's life with all the other bills that they're having to deal with.
Well, can't business deal with this by simply kind of changing the worker from an employee to an independent contractor? Then you don't have to pay benefits. less expensive, it gives the worker more flexibility. I know there are legal issues with that, classifying people as independent contractors versus employees, but is maybe there an unintended consequence here on the labor side?
I mean, I think honestly, in this day and age, you know, any business that thinks that they can just do a bait and switch from moving somebody from a minimum wage job to an independent contractor, you know, the IRS, the Department of Industrial Relations has all of these standards, rules, check boxes to whether they qualify to be an independent contractor. I think that would be a myth to assume that you could try and do that. And even if one of my members said, hey, we're going to try and do that, I would say I think you'd better be very careful.
But even in the gig economy, you've got Uber and these new things out there that these drivers could be independent contractors, they could be employees. I mean, there's going to be a debate about that.
Well, and the state of California seems to be on a full-on assault against Uber and Lyft. I mean, they are trying to crush free enterprise at every turn. And there isn't a day that goes by that you're not seeing an attack from this state legislature on Uber and Lyft and free enterprise companies.
Well, this is going to be a big issue, obviously, the labor part. Let me talk about the political implications, because you and I have talked before about this. The governor seemed to be really focusing on the legislature and on labor unions when discussing minimum wage, and business, I don't want to say complain, but we're concerned that they really weren't part of the equation. I mean, do you think that has political implications?
The governor 2 months ago was against a $15 minimum wage. He said it in his budget summary. He said it would crush businesses, hurt job creation. So I don't know what happened in the 2 months, but all I know...
Politics?
Politics. And he even said, you know, look, this is not about the socioeconomic costs of the minimum wage. This is about politics. This is good politics.
But wouldn't you rather have the legislature kind of weigh in on this issue and maybe be able to change this in the future, as opposed to having something on the November ballot where it gets locked into the state constitution and it's very difficult to change it? You have more flexibility with legislation, don't you?
I would like, definitely the legislative option on one level is better in the sense of a majority trying to amend it. Ballot, you need 2/3 to try and change anything. But the fact of the matter is, this deal was cut over 6 days. I got an email Saturday. There was a press conference Monday. The bill was in appropriations on Wednesday, and it was a done deal and signed by the governor the following Monday.
Have you ever seen a major issue like this move this quickly?
I have never, in the 30 years that I've been involved in politics, seen a deal like this cut this way without business. And I want to be clear, business was never at the table. The Cal Chamber was never invited, the Restaurant Association wasn't invited to the table, NFIB wasn't invited to the table, and that's what really should concern voters the most, that if we're going to start discussing public policy, is this the new way we're going to start doing business in the state of California?
I'm going to leave that as a rhetorical question. I want to thank Tom Scott with the National Federation of Independent Businesses, also Alissa Anderson with the California Budget and Policy Center, and Steve Smith with the California Federation of Labor. Thanks all of them for joining us. If you want to stay current in state and local politics, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or read our e-newsletter, The Maddy Daily, by logging onto our website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.